the value of the resource that the industry is getting. It's a public resource. So we see those funds as actually being of benefit to the public, and they should go to the public. The fees that we are suggesting be charged really pay for the cost of regulation. It's a separate purpose, and as we all know, it's an incredibly lucrative industry, one of the most lucrative in the world, perhaps the most lucrative in the world. And right now, over the last, I believe, 20 years, MMS budget has stayed fairly constant at $200 million in a program that is producing literally hundreds of millions of dollars for the federal government. So that is, if you're talking about, it would spend $200 million, you increase that to provide the additional safety oversight that we're recommending, that is a very, very small fraction of the amount of money this industry will be making off of this resource.
And I know, obviously, Secretary Salazar was just speaking about some of the changes that, that they envision making in terms of fully separating out. But I was wondering if there's anything that he said in terms of when he's talking about creating a new environmental officer, things like that. Both how you think that might change the way we might be prepared for future accidents, and again, to what extent could that potentially raise burdens on industry? If each of you might be able to speak to how you think, particularly it sounds like one of the things right now that the Interior Secretary is focused on is kind of elevating the role of an environmental and safety review, how that's going to play out on the ground. That would be helpful. Kim, can you talk about that?
I think that one of the ways that's going to have to play out is that in the long-term recovery planning that we do post-disaster, we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to what we do in response so that we're not creating extra damage later that we have to worry about in the long term. That was the whole question about dispersants, what's it going to do later. I think that's a relatively new concept for us in terms of incorporating it in planning. Coast Guard's been doing that, EPA has been doing that for a long time, but the other response agencies like FEMA have not been that cognizant of that kind of long-term planning that we have to take into account way up front. I think that's one way. I think that how we use our natural resources needs to be incorporated in our preparedness and our planning from the perspective of how are we structuring ourselves to respond? Do we need to have a more robust environmental response here than perhaps we would have otherwise, given the natural resources that are at risk because of this disaster? And I think that's going to be on an individual basis. Certainly it's a pretty obvious case with a spill. It's not as obvious when we're talking about a natural hazard like an earthquake or a hurricane, because we have to look so much farther and so much deeper into what the damages are.
I think that one of the things that I think struck every member of the commission over the last 6 months was how incredibly productive the Gulf of Mexico is, what a unique and valuable resource it is to the country, how it not only produces this incredible volume of oil and gas, but one of the most prolific fisheries of the country, and this very, very robust tourist economy that's dependent on it too. So it's sort of a three-part economy, all based on the natural resources of the Gulf. So going forward, and Chairman Graham and Riley both referred to the degradation of the Gulf resource over time. So we spent a lot of time actually looking at science. What kind of science has been available? What needs to be invested in? What do you need to know going forward? And ensuring that you do long-term monitoring. I mean, one of the things that we saw after the spill occurred is that then the science community tried to race out there to the extent that they found boats and resources available to do it, to do an assessment of what the base conditions were so they could make the natural resource damage assessment once the spill occurred. And those resources just weren't available. So, I think that the Secretary's recognition that they need more science investment is very important. We make a specific recommendation that the Office of Environmental Studies be separated from the leasing office, that there be a chief scientist, that they have a stronger voice in the decisions that are made about how the offshore resource is managed, particularly where leases occur or don't occur, or what conditions should be put on those leases. So it's not only before, it's during and after. It's an ongoing process, and we need to really make the investment in it because there's so many demands on these very rich resources of the Gulf, and not only in the Gulf, but in our other coasts as well. So if we're going to be using the resources to the extent that we are, and that's only going to increase as our population and the demands of the country increase, we need to increase the scientific investment in a very robust way and actually make decisions that are based on that information. So those are the recommendations that we make are really designed to do that going forward.
And I want Eric to speak to what this is going to mean for industry, but first, Francis, can you say to what extent you think what Salazar is talking about right now is responsive to what the commission asked for?
I think it is responsive. I think there are many more steps to go through, but these things do take time. I think that what Mike Bromwich has done over the last several months to begin to make the changes, the ones the Secretary announced this morning, these are steps of which there are many more that need to be taken because it is, and I thought the Secretary described it well, it does take time. It's a huge challenge to move, 1,000 people from one office to another office, set up a new management system, et cetera. So, we recognize in the report that we expect these things to take time. I think that the Secretary's determination is very, very important. What we tried to set up was a design that would be implemented and could endure one secretary or another, one administration or another, no matter what your point of view was, that those recommendations to ensure that the operations would be as safe as possible, to ensure that the people who work on the rigs are protected and that the environment is protected. We think that, it will take several steps beyond this, but, I was very happy to hear what he said this morning. It's an important step.
And Eric, I was wondering if you could speak to, as there obviously, again, there are proposals that have already been put in place concerning the environment. There are other ones that have been raised. What does that mean for industry? How much more difficult might it be to exploit these resources? To what extent is there any overstepping you're seeing? Or, does all of this seem to make sense within the context of what we've seen?
I think time will tell. We're not sure at this point because it's all going to be in the implementation. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is a very strong document. If you go through it, it's probably better bedtime reading than anything. But if you look at what's within the OCS Lands Act, it provides requirements for strong scientific studies. It requires consideration of what happens to fisheries, to the marine environment, to the seabed, to shipping lanes. You have to look at all these uses of the ocean environment. So we have a significant statute in place for really implementing offshore oil and gas leasing. Ultimately, how is this going to affect the actual processing of plans, of leases, of permits? We've already seen some delays in the processing of environmental assessments. We haven't seen an environmental assessment completed since the Macondo incident occurred, and these are going to be requirements for us to get back to work. And
do you have a sense of how many are stacked up at this point, and particularly on this issue of environmental assessments?
We do not. And the companies are submitting them and hoping that that is one hurdle of many that they'll be able to get through so they can get back to work and produce oil and gas safely for the American economy. So whether it's after a restructure or before, we just want to make sure that, we're following the processes that are set in place in a reasonable manner so that we're not holding up activities.
Francis?
Of course, and I was very pleased to hear Eric say that API was going to be supporting the additional resources that the agency needs because the ability to process permits depends very much on how many people you have to process them and having the right expertise to do it. So these things definitely go hand in hand, and you're probably the best advocate to get the resources that the agency needs.
We're trying. Thank you.
There you go. So now I want to ask one question about the Arctic, and then I thought we could see whether there are questions from the audience. So obviously that's in many ways the next frontier, and clearly is something that's been mentioned in the context of everything that's been going on, but in many ways is a question mark, both in terms of the next 5-year plan and what needs to happen there. So, we do definitely get, I get a different answer of how prepared we are to cope with any sort of accident in the Arctic. If I talk to, for example, a representative of Shell, or I talk to someone from NRDC, or, from some other experts. So I was wondering if all three of you could just kind of address where do you think we are in the Arctic right now, and what needs to happen in order for Americans to have faith that this is an area where we can have oil and gas exploration and not face some of the perhaps maybe even different risks that that people talk about there? Kim.
Wow. Thanks,
Take any
Juliet,
piece.
very much. From the preparedness and planning perspective, we don't explicitly plan for the location we're going to, except to say that we we always coordinate with the Corps of Engineers and their cold weather research stations, and the Coast Guard certainly is prepared for cold weather work with their cutters and the work that they do up north. But the rest of the response community is not necessarily trained and prepared for Arctic work. And that's probably all I should say.
Okay. Francis, obviously the commission was silent on whether or not to have exploration in the Arctic, but could you talk a little, you obviously did raise some points about that, and you have some opinion.
Yes, what we did in the Arctic was really look at. Oh yeah, your mic. Hello. Might be able to use this one. We looked at, and we heard from actually untold numbers of people from Alaska, companies who are interested in the Arctic, scientists who are working in the Arctic, organizations, state government. And what we report in the commission report is a major gap in response. We also reported on a science gap. But basically, the conditions of operating in the Arctic, dark a good deal of the year, frozen a good deal of the year, fog, terrible storms, and an incredibly rich marine environment, create conditions that we can't respond to at this time. And, when you look at the response in the Gulf of Mexico, fairly comparatively benign environment. Warm water, most sophisticated industry infrastructure lining the coast, and yet I would say we struggled at best to respond to a colossal spill. So, in looking at both what the technology is that exists for the Arctic, it's no different than the technology that exists for the Gulf of Mexico. What the capability of the Coast Guard, the lead response agency is, closest Coast Guard facility is 1,000 miles from where the drilling is proposed. We're just not prepared up there. So we actually, in the report, make a series of recommendations for what has to be available before you could move forward and ensure that you have the response capability. One is to be sure that the company's response plans and technology is available to that the Coast Guard is really sourced to do it. And so right now, what we said is we're not ready to do it.
And Eric would love to.
Just 2 points. The first is operating in the Arctic is not a new thing for the industry. The industry's been operating in the Canadian Arctic for decades now and has had a very strong record there. And you asked about how the public can be confident in our ability to operate. I would just suggest you look at the plans that have been submitted to operate in the Arctic. You're probably better off talking to Shell, but these are very robust plans with multiple layers of contingencies in place to respond, but also to prevent it from any kind of incident from occurring at all. And they're very well tailored, and they're extremely limited in the time frame they're allowed to operate, in terms of you just can't do this any time of the year. There's a window, and it's relatively short when compared to being able to operate in the Gulf year round. So the plan itself speaks for itself and shows that there's a strong plan in place with several layers to respond to any type of incident that may occur.
Perfect. So we have a bunch of smart questions from the audience, so I'm just going to move directly for them. This first one is for Eric. It says, you mentioned API is already lobbying and using oil and gas revenues to fully staff and support the regulatory agencies. Do you also expect API to support using a percentage of oil and gas revenues from royalties and bonus bids for ocean protection and restoration, and not just in the producing states, but in all coastal states? Is that something that API has taken?
Well, our position has been primarily to leave that up to the policymakers based upon the democratic process as to how the public wants them to see that money spent. But I will say that we supported the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, under which the coastal states are receiving additional funds in terms of revenue sharing, so that they're able to use that money